Hi, I'm Miles, and this is Auto-Minded. I'm here with 3 things you didn't know about the Lotus Esprit. And it's kind of a headline kind of thing to say there's 3 things you absolutely didn't know, but we can probably tell you something you didn't have before, like, well, do you know that the Esprit could have been an Aston Martin? Let me paint a little bit of a picture for you. It's the 1960s, you're Lotus, and you're a world championship race team, but, well, your consumer cars, they don't enjoy the same prestige that, say, Porsche or Ferrari do. And part of the reason is because Lotus was seen as a kit car maker. That's because they were a kit car maker, because they did that for the home market in the UK especially because, well, that was a great tax dodge. But Colin Chapman really wanted to change all that. He wanted to move everything up market. So for the 1970s, he revamped the entire line. That meant the Elite, the Eclat, and the Esprit. But there was also a little bit of doubt going on there because he was now asking basically Mercedes money for Lotus cars. So he thought maybe he should go brand shopping a little bit, and one of the ones he really looked at was Aston Martin because, well, the Aston Martin name will definitely elevate your prestige. But as they dug into it a little bit more, they never really got to that point where they were going to try to swap an Aston badge onto an Esprit, and that was just because all that old world charm you know for Aston and hand-beating panels, well, it just wasn't going to work for them. But, well, you really just have to love the what if would have been out of that one, because just think about it. An Aston plus a Lotus, that would have been the ultimate James Bond car. And if we're actually thinking in reality, one of the really cool things that were happening with Aston around that time was they were getting into their V8 era. It was an alloy block, dual overhead cam, nice big V8, and, well, quite frankly, that was something Lotus might have been really interested in, because that brings us to our second point, which is the Esprit was always intended to have V8 power. Now, Lotus always loved V8 power. In fact, that's exactly what they won with on the tracks, and so they're also looking to put some of that into their consumer cars, and so they were always looking to develop one of their own. In the 1960s, they even had an agreement with De Tomaso to get the V8 together, but that kind of fell through. But the plans were always sitting in the background, and that's why when they were developing the Esprit, it was going to be a car that was going to have a V8 as an upgraded option. But, well, as that car got developed and got closer to the road, the world really changed. There were financial and fuel crises that, well, just made it look like V8 power was on its way out. And that's why it never went in initially, and in fact, that's why they went the turbocharging route. But, well, the Esprit had so much staying power that it actually outlived all those problems, and so 20 years after it was born, it finally got the V8 power that it was always supposed to have. Now, one thing I want to get back to is the idea of Aston Martin, because I did mention they had a V8 motor, and, well, you really don't hear much about Lotus ever trying to do anything with that Aston Martin engine, and can be many reasons for that. One, it could be just because that was a little bit too heavy or just not right because it was more intended for grand touring vehicles. But also, there's the other part of history, which is anytime, especially in that early 1970s era when Aston Martin was really looking for help and they had their back against the wall, well, it was also a lot of the time that Lotus's margins were pretty thin too, and so these two probably weren't really too good about partnering up because, well, financial problems were something that plagued Lotus for a good bit of time, and that's what gets us to our third point, which is the DeLorean DMC-12 and the Lotus Esprit were pretty close siblings. It's really difficult being a small, independent auto manufacturer out there, and so Lotus had to get creative with their financials pretty often. In fact, it was Colin Chapman who turned race cars into rolling billboards. So you're out there just barely surviving the struggle, and just imagine how angry you would be when you find out that your government gave your tax dollars to an American so he could build a competing car in Belfast. So if you're Chapman, you almost feel like you're doing a patriotic duty by signing a development contract with DeLorean so that you can claw back some of that money. And Lotus did genuinely do right by at least the DMC-12 because, well, that car really needed a lot of development to make it roadworthy, safe, and just something that you could produce. And Lotus was the right company to do it because, well, anybody else out there, like, say, Porsche, well, they could have helped with development too, but they would have cost much more and it would have taken a lot more time. Now, of course, the moment that I bring up Chapman, DeLorean, and money, I've stepped into a whole world of hurt about missing funds. And, well, quite frankly, if you want me to talk about that, mention that in the comments because it's a big story that deserves its own video. But all we really need to know here right now is that, well, when the DMC-12 went into production, it just looked like a Lotus Esprit underneath the skin with its engine put back just a little bit further. And quite frankly, there's also not really anything that's suspect about it because that's all the Lotus backbone chassis at work. that's what they used in all their cars at the time. And so what Lotus was really doing was they were just giving DeLorean the benefit of their engineering expertise. And that was exactly that part of the contract they were supposed to do. And so, at least in that aspect, it was mission accomplished. Of course, still, you ask the British taxpayers if they overpaid for all of it, and well, yeah, like I said, that is a story for a different time, because right now, all I was really hoping for is that you learned a little something new about that interesting and evergreen Lotus Esprit. Thank you for watching.